At what point is the private sector willing to pay to do what needs to be done in the region?
We have a diet of limitations, but not a sufficient discourse on our possibilities.
This is a critical step in our regional integration process.
Mistrust within countries is defeating us. It's not an economic matter, that is a matter for mindset.
West Indian people, we are a gem.
Let's advance our partnership together through the region.
Let us organize and do that together.
We need to ensure that there's transparency in what we do.
I do it because I love it. I'm passionate about watching things grow.
If there's a will, you will find a way to make it happen.
And I would like to take this opportunity to introduce our moderator for this session, Mr. Sasha Silva, who's a trade economist with World Trade Institute, advisors in Geneva. And during the past 10 years, Sasha has advised public and private institutions on trade policy, agriculture competitiveness, and diversification, trade negotiations, particularly in WTO, regional and bilateral contexts, economic governance, and a host of other things. And I had the opportunity of meeting Sasha a few years ago when he came as a part of a team of very young professionals from then the CRNM to Belize. And I at the time was beginning to step back a bit from trade issues, and I looked at the 4 or 5 of them, and they all walked up to the head table, opened their laptops, and began reading all the emails, while the Belizeans slowly filtered in for an 11 a.m. start to a 9 o'clock meeting, so which we hope won't happen here today. So Sasha, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, David. That is easily the most backhanded compliment I've gotten. Right. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming back. There's been a bit of a thinning of the ranks after the coffee break. I wanted to thank Caribbean Export, first of all, for rescuing me from the winter in Geneva, but also for putting on, frankly, a very chic conference. Frankly, if all meetings in the Caribbean were this nice, I think they would be as well attended. I wanted to very quickly introduce my co-panelists. I have, in order of speaking, the Honorable Anthony Hilton, who is the Minister of Industry, Investment, and Commerce in Jamaica. And not only that, he is also a distinguished lawyer in his own right. To his right, Professor Victor Bulmer-Thomas, who is a professor of economics at the University of London, wears also a lot of hats, and has been really one of the pioneers of Latin American studies in the UK and elsewhere. And I'm here also to shamelessly plug his new book, The Economic History of the Caribbean Since the Napoleonic Wars, which will become as required reading as From Columbus to Castro by Eric Williams was for scholars of the region. To his right, Ramesh Ramdeen, the CEO of the Trinidad and Tobago Manufacturers Association. I was just telling Ramesh how wonderful it was to see him in that position, given that he was an indefatigable presence during the IPA negotiations that were very fatiguing. And to his right, Sheldon McLean, who's the Regional Trade Policy Advisor. He is the hub at the CARICOM Secretariat for the Commonwealth Secretariat Hubs and Spokes project. Ladies and gentlemen, as the moderator, I'd like to try to set as good an example in terms of brevity and keeping to time. I realize I'm standing now between you and lunch, which is the least interesting speaking slot, apart from maybe the one after lunch. Colleagues, the West Indian report really focused on the idea of export-led growth. And we traditionally see FTAs as the vehicle for that export-led growth. The question is really, we have now an experience, South-South negotiations, we have North-South negotiations. What has actually happened in practice? And as we now face other people knocking on the door of the Caribbean to say, can you please negotiate an FTA with us? What does it mean for our future negotiations? Now, I prepared a study for Caribbean export, and those of you that may have seen it, there's a lot of tables and graphs which I will spare you today. The point is more to provoke discussion and to encourage you to read the document at a later time. Well, since we've just elected a pope, let me start with biblical questions. Why are we here? It is, as noted earlier, it is a difficult time to be talking about trade issues here in the region. We have the DR having paused its negotiations with Taiwan and with Canada. We have CARICOM facing what one could characterize as a bit of an existential crisis, both in the media, on the streets, and among the technical experts. We have a sense of dissatisfaction with where the CSME is going. We have an agreement with the Europeans that faces a very large implementation gap. We have Central America and Mercosur, who are knocking at the door, and the response is still yet to come. We have a process between CARICOM and the Dominican Republic that is maybe not advancing to everyone's satisfaction. And this state of affairs is really in direct contrast with what is happening outside of the region. The pace of integration going on outside the Caribbean can only be described as feverish. Everyone is signing FTAs left, right, and center. And so there are fears, perhaps not unfounded, that the region is somewhat being left behind. We also stand, as the panel this morning noted, 20 years after the publication of the report of the West Indies Commission. Now, I'd like to just pause here and quickly say that the fact that this report is not available online, or that one has to go through great efforts to find a printed copy, is a scandal. And if anything comes out of this meeting, it's that this publication can be easily found. We find actually that despite the fact that there's been huge changes in the global environment, a lot of these same existential questions were being faced by the Commission. There's the same fears of being left behind. This is in the NAFTA context. The same frustrations with the gap between rhetoric and implementation. So what we want to look at is, well, in terms of FTAs, what's happened between then and now? And what does the wisdom of what's in that report, and there is so much wisdom, not just on the issue of trade, but especially on export-led growth, what does the Commission tell us that could guide us now? Now, we tend to start here in the region always with the negative, and I'd like to start by looking at the positive. There's a Clint Eastwood movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I'll start with the good, the not so good, and the complicated. And first, let's start with the issue of market access. Of the few FTAs that the region has signed, and I mean few relative to, if you look at the number of FTAs that say Costa Rica has signed, I mean the region has actually signed fairly few of them. The market opportunities are actually pretty good. When we look at what has been signed with the northern neighbors, DR CAFTA, the EPA, tariffs are zero, right? Whatever access that we had in those northern markets, the preferential access under Cotonou or under CBI, the access tends to expand in a lot of places what was there. It locks it in and contains changes in things like rules of origin. So there are real benefits there. For the South-South agreements, these are the agreements with Costa Rica, Cuba, Venezuela, and Colombia. The exclusions lists, again, are relatively short. They don't cover pages and pages and pages of things. Or in some cases, for example, they're zero under DR CAFTA. So that's the good situation. The not so good is that those agreements miss a lot. The first is the issue of services. There is a complete absence of services in the region's South-South FTAs. The provisions are there, but they are all pending the completion of the internal regime within the common market, which they should, but that process has been delayed for some time. Still on the issue of services, where there's been opening in the services area in our North-South agreements in DR CAFTA or in the case of the EPA, really what's GATS plus, what's above the WTO, is not in very, very commercially meaningful sectors. There's a lot of sectors, but it may not have a lot of commercial meat to it. The second is that even for goods, there's really no common set of opportunities that are there. And this is a real problem, I think, for exporters. If you want to build an export strategy based on the region's FTAs, you'll find that a product is liberalized here, but excluded there, and liberalized here. I just want to show you, just for a point of comparison, and one doesn't have to read the individual elements. This is comparing the exclusions lists of all of the region's South-South FTAs. Gray is where it's excluded, white is where it's not. And you can see that there's not really a common approach. Only spices and jams and jellies actually has open access across, right? But there's a really sort of patchwork approach. So I talked about the good, I talked about the not so good, and then where it gets complicated. The issue of regional preference. What really does it mean for the region's FTAs, and what does it mean for market access opportunities? In goods, of course, there are major items that are touched by regional preference, say in CARICOM, DR CARICOM, the issue of cement, excluded in DR CARICOM, liberalized in the EPA. There's the whole issue of what regional preference means for DR access, for example, in the LDCs. There's an obligation in DR CARICOM to revisit that issue. Does the EPA regional preference prejudge the outcome of that process? What does regional preference mean for services? Again, there's meant to be a built-in negotiating agenda, but has that now been thrown out of the window by the regional preference negotiations? And would that outcome have looked different had we not had the agreement with the Europeans? The other unknown in terms of market opportunities is Haiti. This is, of course, the biggest market in population terms in CARICOM. The question is, where is that process now? There are 42 lines which Haiti has access one way into CARICOM, but in terms of CARICOM access into Haiti, when will that integration happen? In what respect? How will Haiti's market sensitivities be treated? So the summary on opportunities. Again, these are just the opportunities that are there on paper. There's a positive picture overall in terms of what we have access to, but there's some important patches that are missing. The implementation is a bit unclear, and a lot of unresolved questions. Remember, Donald Rumsfeld had this famous comment about known unknowns. Well, there are a lot of known unknowns. And the biggest thing, particularly for our North-South agreements, we tend to forget that the FTA effect takes a long time to kick in. We only signed the EPA a few years ago. A lot of countries haven't even started to implement the goods schedule. So has there really even been an EPA effect to mention? The global recession has affected everyone's exports. So really, if you look at exports over the last 4 years, you can't get a picture of how the region has quote-unquote performed under the FTA because there's been a massive shock to demand. So those are the opportunities, but what about the actual performance? And here, you usually say there are pluses and minuses. Here, I'll say that there are minuses and pluses. And I'll break my rule by starting with the negative parts. In CARIFORM, particularly in CARICOM, the tale of FTAs is a tale, sadly, of trade deficits. And just look at these graphs. And they were so clear to me, I feel like I didn't even have to put an axis on them. Here we have CARICOM Costa Rica, the black line being our imports and the gray being the exports. And you can see Costa Rica gaining market share while ours swing quite widely. In the case of CARICOM Colombia, the same picture, imports on the top, exports on the bottom. DR trade with the US under DR CAFTA, again, imports from the US on the top. It began with a trade surplus in favor of the DR, and then that got reversed over the course of the few years. On the CARICOM side, it gets even more bleak when you look at, in the aggregate, when you remove Trinidad and Tobago from the equation, particularly its petroleum, the iron and steel, You look at its chemicals. Here you have in CARICOM DR the first 3 sets of columns. This is basically the full CARICOM set. And I should note, whenever I speak in the FTA context, these are only the countries that are the signatories. So, for example, not the Bahamas and not Haiti. There's a positive trade balance here when you include Trinidad and Tobago. You remove Trinidad and Tobago, and not only does the amount of trade shrink dramatically, but also the trade balance becomes negative as well. But let's move from the minuses to the pluses. We've seen some bright spots, right? We see services trade with the EU. This is the region's balance with the EU, and it's been positive. This is largely due to tourism, but it is positive. And we see also, in respect to goods trade, once we remove some of the distorting factors, that there have actually been positive developments under the FTAs, or at least under the time period that the FTAs were negotiated. We see that DR agriculture and industry, frankly, DR trade into CARICOM under the FTA has increased by large margins, plastics and cement, food and fertilizer. We see that DR access into the US for some of its agricultural goods, some of the free zone items. We see, of course, Trinidad and Tobago's successes in petroleum and in heavy industries. These are often discounted, but I mean, these are undoubted successes under these FTAs. We see the OECS increasing its exports of electronic components, of spices. We see Belize's agricultural industries racking up real export increases to major markets. We see things like the paper label industry in Barbados exporting. We see food preparations from Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago. Across the board successes in terms of rum, mining in Guyana. So there are bright spots. But there are 2 questions. The first is, what about services? There's really no data for us to be able to tell whether there has been a kind of a services effect under a lot of the agreements. This goes for even in the US market. If you go to the USTR website and you try to find services data under DR CAFTA, they don't have it. And in the case of the EPA, we only have the Europeans to rely on. The second, and I think more important question is, has access under the FTAs really been the deciding factor? Right? Has there really been an effect? Right? Has the access, have these bright spots been worth the time and the energy that was spent in the negotiations, and the fact that overall there's this picture of trade deficits, the fact that we face new competition in our markets? What's the FTA effect being? I'm going to close here by first noting, well, listen, we've seen the good, the market opportunities. We've seen the bad in terms of where things have actually gone. And it brings, I think, into a wider question of what it is that the region expects from its free trade negotiations. The EPA experience, which is the one that I have direct experience of having managed the goods offer, even for a situation where in revenue terms and in competition terms, the sky doesn't fall in because most of the revenue and production items were excluded, can be an exhausting and very long and very expensive process, right? And it's also one that creates very high expectations from people in terms of what it's meant to achieve. You know, when you spend 6 years negotiating an agreement, people expect results. And even simple South-South free trade agreements can dominate the work of a trade official for 3 or 4 years. And of course, we know that in the region, there's usually one person who is dealing with all of the trade issues. And to make matters worse, if you ask a lot of the exporters what are the main problems that they're facing in accessing markets, it's not usually the issue of tariffs. But most of the region's FTAs are focused only on tariffs and only focused on goods. Right? They will talk to you about non-tariff barriers. They'll talk to you about the 16 different technical requirements that a Barbadian exporter of pepper sauce faces in Europe, including 4 different labeling requirements. They'll talk to you about the fact that it's wonderful we have this access in services, but look at all of these restrictions. Look at how they're applying economic needs tests. They'll talk to you about the constraints at home. They'll talk to you about financing issues. They'll talk to you about infrastructure, right? And again, the FTAs in the region, the reason that there's an enthusiasm gap is because they don't talk about any of these things. They talk about them in a way of, well, we reaffirm WTO commitments to Y and Z, but in terms of really where the meat happens, it's in tariffs. And frankly, most of the exporters, tariffs are not their major issue. There's also a fear, I'd say, of the unknown when it comes to the issue of services. What people don't have data to deal with, they tend to shy away from. Goods, people like to deal with it because we have data. We understand what tariffs are. You can do studies, and I mean, it's been great for my career. But in terms of services, it's harder to get a sense of what an impact of a services agreement is. So governments instinctively shy away from this. And for me, one of the real problems here in the region is the lack of services data. And that feeds into things like the CSME regime, the fact that there hasn't been a common agreement, which is now holding up progress in the rest of the negotiations. So I think that one has to appreciate when you say, well, the FTAs haven't served the region well, they're also highly, highly limited instruments. In any context, an FTA is a limited instrument. In the Caribbean context, it is especially so. Fortunately, and I want to bring us back to the report of the West Indian Commission, which really should be required reading. They were faced with a lot of the same issues, and their guidance is something that's really relevant today. The focus, if I can be so impetuous as to try to summarize some of their recommendation, was to really focus on the key strengths. Appreciate the limits that these exercises have, and focus on the areas that have some commercial logic. Focus on things where there is actually a constituency of people outside of the public sector to push for implementation. Because when you look at a lot of the FTAs, you ask yourself, where is the constituency to push the government to make sure that the tariff on X product actually goes down, or to make sure that the Europeans actually honor their commitment? Where is the constituency? So it means making sure that our FTA negotiations are focused in things like services, despite the worries about data, on things like, especially for example, areas of strength like tourism, on agro processing, on things like furniture, on things on handicrafts, and I think this is where Caribbean Export in particular does a great job in terms of forward thinking on these targeted niches. This is where we really need to go, and this is 20 years ago where the commissioner said we needed to go. Right? It also means, I think, focusing the energy of FTA negotiations, rather than trying to go on these very grand exercises covering 5,200 lines in the tariff, focus on the 3 or 4 things that really, really matter. Right? As I said, even negotiating something where you have no interest is an exhausting, expensive exercise. Right? You can do it if you have a team of 20 negotiators, and no one does here. Finally, there we go. There's, I think, the issue of making sure that we have to understand that FTAs can't always solve structural issues, right? There is no single magic bullet, and that, I think, is all the more reason why we need to be a little bit more targeted in the way that we work our FTAs. I'm going to, at this point, hand over to our panel. And I hope that some of these issues of really how we can look on these export performances in the region, how this can inform a lot of our FTA negotiating strategies will be highlighted. Thank you so much.